Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now, here's your host, Roxanne Derhodge.
Our interview last week was so good that we decided to turn it into a two-part series. If you missed last week, you'll find the link in the show notes. It's not mandatory that you listen, but we want to make sure that you don't miss out on this amazing conversation.
Hi, everyone. It's Roxanne Derhodge. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Today, I have a colleague that I met just recently in Rome and had the pleasure of sitting through her workshop, which was quite fascinating. And this is Avinder Laroya, and she's based in Switzerland. And she's done some fascinating work. I often say that, when we say, do you need a lawyer? It's good to have the best lawyer, but also when you're looking at mediating situations, the other end of it, Avinder does both, which I loved sitting through what she shared with us in Rome. So Avinder, thanks so much for coming on and spending the time with us today.
Thank you for having me, Roxanne. I'm really pleased to be here and to speak to you about mediation.
Right. And I think at the typical kind of scenario, if you're an orator and you're able to articulate and synthesize information and feed it back, that would be a party you want to be in mediation with. But let's talk with the person, and I was going to say guy or man, but it doesn't need not only be men that get aggressive. How do you deal with individuals like that to kind of put them into a space where they're using the logical part of their brain versus kind of being that reactive kind of emotional part of the brain? What are there certain, you said there's a lot of techniques that you use, or can you share one of those things that maybe you use? And I'm thinking for most of us, right, is that's not something that we all want to get better at when we deal with people that are overly aggressive or react, quick to be a bit on the explosive end.
Sure. Often when people are very passionate or when they're describing the injustice that they feel, they obviously have a sense of heightened emotion and they can get quite vocal and aggressive because all their anger is coming out. So at that point, the techniques and tools that I use is to really listen to that person and help them to also feel that they are being listened to and acknowledge whatever they are feeling, because perhaps it may be something that they've never told anyone else or had the confidence to tell anyone else. So they may and ensure that they are not feeling judged, and allow them to have that time to say whatever it is they want to say, and give them that space. Silence is a pretty powerful tool. So allowing someone to, sometimes people they've said it to themselves inside, but they have never heard themselves say it. So after when they've actually heard what they've said, silence is actually quite a good tool to help them to reflect. The other thing I use is in terms of repeating back what they've said, so that they are actually hearing the words that they've said, and ask them how do they feel about that. How do they? Is that the right word? Help them to work through the emotion, the situation, in a sense, and sometimes people need to just take a step back. Sometimes the emotions are so heightened that they need some time to pull back and to review through. It doesn't have to be, sometimes, of course, in certain circumstances, there may be time limits with mediation in order to, especially in a commercial instance, where they want to get to a resolution. because of, it's impacting a project or it's impacting a deal. But perhaps when it comes to like employment disputes, workplace disputes, I often give the parties a few days, because I often interview and have individual sessions with the parties in dispute to understand from their point of view what's going on, and then I give them the time to reflect before we come together as a group.
Okay.
And I find that once they've had the opportunity to have the tears, have the tissue box ready, and to get everything out, actually they feel a lot better.
Yeah, just being heard and being seen, sometimes it's such a powerful thing to move along the process.
It's often underestimated, but to actually give someone the space, a non-judgmental space, to just be heard and just to listen, and whatever it is they feel inside, is so powerful, because often we have people that listen to us and then give us advice or give us contrary information, and that doesn't allow us to process whatever's going on inside. But through mediation, as a facilitator, it's a non-judgmental space.
So your setup of that space and trust with you becomes very, very fundamental. And it really depends, from listening to you, with me as a psychologist, that's I always say the first rung of the ladder is when I'm coaching or seeing someone in practice, is that I often say they're checking me out, right? It takes them, and it's not personally about me, but it's about everything that they bring with them through, how many years of their life, and that imprint. They're adjusting it to try to figure out, can they let me proceed? Do I have the qualities to be perceived as someone I can allow into that space, which is really a big privilege if you think about what you do, Avinder, because when people are in a space, they're oftentimes they're hurt or they're in pain, and then you're trying to resolve it, but they're stuck in that pain, and they want to move along, but they're trying to figure out, how am I going to move along? And you become really the solution to help them maybe adjust
Absolutely.
that
I mean,
space.
often people are in disputes, are experiencing a lot of mental health issues, and as a consequence of going into mediation, I'm actually trained as a mental health first aider, because oftentimes I've noticed that, especially in workplace conflicts, that people are really facing trauma, a lot of trauma, and there are instances where people are also experiencing PTSD, and so if someone is in that heightened sense of mindset, there is no way they can communicate effectively in a mediation to settle the situation. So as a mental health first aider, I've had to learn to recognize those signals, because at that point I would stop the mediation and encourage them to get professional help, because I'm not an expert like yourself in that. And sometimes people don't recognize that they are in that situation, because they are, some people are always heightened, they're agitated and because of the situation, and then
they're not aware that it's abnormal
by their company,
but
they're not ready for it.
Absolutely. And they're not realizing that this stance that they're coming forward to, it's not healthy, because if it's sort of a space that they've lived in for a long period of time, to them it's like, what do you mean? I've never experienced what you're talking about. So it makes sense. So obviously at that point, mediation breaks down, and you're looking at referring that person to get the supports to maybe return when they're in a better psychological and emotional state to be able to proceed along the process. So let's talk a little bit, so you said you do a lot of employee disputes. Let's talk a little bit about the commercial or international work that you've done, because when you shared some of it through your workshop. It was fascinating. She shared a case, and I was like all in, because there was so many, so many players and so many variables, that I think it's something that I'm sure companies that or leaders that might be listening that have that's a multinational might be interested in kind of that space. So what is it that you think would be helpful for, say, CEOs or leaders listening about corporate mediation?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So, with the mediation, I think in current, looking at where we are as a world right now, we've come out of an incredibly unrealistic period of time with the COVID pandemic. It's affected us all worldwide. We are all going through incredible economic challenges, and as a consequence, businesses are having to make decisions and move, trying to figure out ways to move forward. I mean, businesses have often, and CEOs and managers have had to make decisions in various economic cycles throughout the years. But what we are facing at the current stage is unprecedented in so many ways, because the usual tools and the usual systems that we normally use are kind of not working. And I don't know whether you follow English politics. We have had further issues with the merry-go-round that's been happening with the change of premiership, and hopefully, fingers crossed, things will smooth out now. But in terms of public policy, when public policy is not in alignment with economic changes, it disrupts how businesses can move forward. With the economic changes due to COVID, it's given a lot of supply chain issues. There's been a lot of supply chain disruption. And as a consequence, many companies, many startups with investors are having the mediation can be used in terms of helping to just have those difficult discussions, because obviously startups growing and developing in this economic climate is a challenge in some sectors, and investors obviously want to get a return, an economic return. So how do you have those difficult conversations? Sometimes there are issues where there may be a number of projects that are on the table, but because of the lack of economic clarity or the disruptions to the supply chain, there is a clash between what the management want and the board want and what investors want. Mm-hmm. So there's everyone has got their own objectives and the way that they want to go forward. So mediation is a way for boards that are clashing, or boards that are clashing with investors, to have that opportunity to have a neutral facilitator to try and help the two sides to listen and understand each other, that they may not be able to do directly. And often, we've seen a lot that in the press, for instance, there's a heightened a number of companies that are going insolvent. So difficult decisions are being made and being discussed in boardrooms right now because of the economic and supply chain disruption. So how do you have those difficult conversations with your team if you have to make redundancies, and there's not an agreement as to who's going to go, who's going to stay, who are you going to pin the blame on in the board, or how are you going to report to that investor that things are not going so well? And if often, managers, board members, we all are trained in our technical abilities. And often it's technical people that become promoted to managerial or board member roles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're great communicators or great facilitators of discussion or negotiators. And these are specialist skills. Even as lawyers, we know how to negotiate contracts, but negotiating emotions It's not something that lawyers generally do, but as a mediator, as a facilitator, that is exactly what we do. We look at the whole, the human behavior, and obviously these relationships have a dynamic impact on the progression and development and the culture of the organization. And without having these difficult conversations in a in a in a an environment where people can speak up without judgment, and having that ability to speak up. A lot of companies now are having to comply with ESG, environmental social governance. So a lot of difficult conversations are happening due to that as well. And there's been a lot of cases where companies who are saying that they are green, have green credentials, it's not exactly that true. So, the term used for that is greenwashing. How do you deal with that as a board? How do you deal with that as a company? Because then that's come out to your client, to your customer base.
And your culture too, because you may be attracting people that are, completely buying into the company or wanting to be associated with the company. And then if they're not living that value that they say they're living, that could really on an international stage create that perception of the brand, and like you said, your customers, and how are you going to build that business
too. So as a mediator, as a facilitator, you're actually helping to facilitate dialogue with the stakeholders, your known stakeholders and those unknown stakeholders. In the case that I went through in Rome, you will remember that I talked about stakeholders, and the ones that the company hadn't even acknowledged or had even thought of. There were indirect stakeholders which had an impact in how the company was perceived, and how they were able to move forward with that particular dispute, because it impacted many communities and people even outside of that country, if you remember. So
right, I know, because it was very multifaceted. You had two companies, and then there was manufacturing elements in different countries, and all the ripple effect. And that's what I found I really enjoyed that, because I thought, you think of like a pebble in a river, but quite literally there was reverberations from lots of different elements, and how you had to work with all the different elements to kind of understand what it would take to move them along. And that sounds like it's a lot of work. So when you're working with something like that, Avinder, are you processing it with a team, or once you've had these meetings, and like you said, you interview all the people involved, board, management, sometimes labor, all those things, are you going back to, say, a colleague or that you're synthesizing this with, or are you kind of going through the process yourself before you kind of proceed on to the next step?
It's a mixture of the two. Certainly, unlike an advisory role where you don't get impacted with all the emotional stuff that's being brought forward, you do need to take that space to center yourself, for sure. And yes, certainly I work with co-mediators and other experts when required. Each situation is different, so I certainly like to work as a team in resolving issues if required. It depends on the situation. I mean, remember the example I gave? We had 3 different mediators in that instance, and each one had a different approach. So and a different way of viewing the dispute, and this is where having being unbiased and being aware of your own limitations, in a sense. If you feel strongly about a particular situation, then it's unfair for the parties if you think that you can be independent, because you yourself should be honest with yourself and say, well, I can't deal with this because I have a strong opinion about this situation, and that way you're not independent and impartial. So you do
So
have
you're like
to
looking for
have that
internal,
integrity.
yeah, like an
So if
internal
you're gonna,
conflict that you're kind of saying, this is kind of feeling like, "Ugh, I kind of can see this person's position more so, and I don't know that I can create the space to move from that. At that point, you would say to the company or whatever that you're going to bring somebody else on to help you
yeah,
out
you
with
have to be, this is where self-awareness and constantly working on your own biases and your own thought process is so important, because
that.
as you go along, and it's a journey with peace building, things that may have affected you before may not be the case, further down the road, because you've learnt to, I mean, I'm sure it's the same when you were first started out.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because when we train as psychologists, we go in. There's transfer. I'm sure you guys probably have the concept, or maybe if it's the same term, transference, counter-transference, where the client can say align to you because you remind them of their sister, who maybe wasn't so kind to them or whatever. It's the same thing, or even us. The other way is counter-transference, where we're having a reaction based on a frame of reference in our life. So that what happens is you're like, whoa, I'm having this feeling or reaction to this conversation that has nothing to do with the two people across from each other. It's more about me. And like, with anything, you go back, it's absolutely awareness. It's processing it, understanding it. I mean, you're a human being at the end of the day as well. But what is it, is if there's a limitation, to call it, to your point, because then I'm not, working in the best interest of the client. It becomes more about me. And then how do I clear that block if I were to proceed, and should I proceed? And sometimes having that conversation openly with someone else in the field like you would allows you to make the best decision for that client, because in the end of the day, it's for the client, right?
Yes, and this is the main difference with mediation, because you're
Yeah.
dealing with people's emotions, because you're dealing with their behavior, and really delving into who is in front of you as a
Mhm.
person, as opposed to as a lawyer or even as an arbitrator, you're looking at the legal arguments, you're looking at the legal process, you're looking at the documents. Yeah, so the emotions are in a lot of ways taken out.
Yeah, it's kind of packed
Often,
away off to the side, and you're thinking, oh, I feel this. However, it doesn't matter. What's the precedent, or what's all the facts in front of me, and being able to fight that case for whoever you're working on behalf of. Like I said, it feels like it's two different fields in a way, even though, I could see this could be cross-pollination of skills that would be helpful. But then technically who you're working on behalf of is the shift in the client. So for leaders out there, Avinder, we know that most people deal with conflict and change and shifting and resizing, and the quiet quitting that we're talking about. There's a lot going on in companies, to your point, post-pandemic. It probably is not that it wasn't there before, but it's now, I think, lots of light has been shone on things that maybe people kind of could gloss over and move on, and now not so much. We don't have that same kind of time. So for leaders or CEOs listening, what kind of things would you tell them about considering, about thinking about some of those conflicts or situations in their companies? What would you tell them about mediation?
mediation helps you to have those difficult conversations in a safe, confidential environment. So often there are situations like, as I mentioned before, like, most times people who have been promoted to managerial positions are technical people who are very good technically. They've done really well, and so they've been promoted, and all of a sudden they are managing people, but they have never really managed people before. And all of a sudden they've got people coming to them with problems when really they're a technical person, so they don't know how to, so that's when some conflicts can arise, for instance.
Mhm.
um, and that all depends on what support structures do that organization have. Are there any training programs for that new manager, or even a slightly more established manager, to deal with the relationships in the department, in the building, in the organization? What kind of psychological safety have they evolved. Often when it comes to people, they say, oh, that's the HR's role. That's HR's problem. If someone's being difficult, and they may be perceived to be difficult by that person, but if you break it down, it could be because they have a lack of clarity on their role. They have a lack of clarity in the boundaries of the situation. There's often a lack of communication as to what their role is, in a sense, or there are many different aspects that could be triggering the dispute. So one would have to look at, well, what is the culture? What's policies? I mean, sometimes people have policies, but they're not living policies. Some people have policies just for the sake of it, in a sense. And often, sometimes, for instance, what would you do if employee A says to employee B, oh, I didn't have time to do some work, but we're going to go into a meeting now. Can you just tell them, oh, I wasn't able to do it because I was stuck with doing something else? A little white lie. As employee B, what have you, what kind of training and skills? Oh, how can you help that employee B who may be put in a difficult situation at that point because employee A is a senior to them?
Right.
How would you
Yes.
help employee B as an organizational structure to be able to feel comfortable enough to say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to cover your back. I'm not going to lie for you. You have to own up that you didn't do it.
Right.
Because
So
often these small
roles and
conversations happen in the
responsibilities.
office.
Yeah. And hierarchical structures. That's such a good point. So I think companies need to understand that, if this infrastructure doesn't exist, to your point, that's when something like a mediation with your team would be, or having a conversation to at least see what is in the best interest, versus assuming that each manager, or get training to ensure that you get people to the level that they can deliver. And
Yeah, I
what's
mean, I
needed.
offer training programs to assist with this, and I also like to delve deep into a company and understand what the people dynamic is, because you're dealing
Right.
with personalities, egos, values. Often we have mission and value statements as companies, but what does that actually mean when it comes down to the ground? And how is
Right.
that
When the
being
rubber hits the road, like they say, how does it translate, and how are people acting in accordance with those mission, visions, values? You're right. Often, a lot of companies I work with, it's out of alignment. It's kind of the thing they put on the wall, but when you have difficult situations, it's not what people are referring back to. So reality is one, and day to day is another. And then, of course, then you get into that tumbleweed where their little things become bigger things, and then you're having a lot of landmines throughout the company, and then what happens to your people managers and your HR, and what's happening to the bottom line at that point. It's a bit of a
I've
war
just recently
zone.
written an article which is on my blog now, if you want to have a look. It's all about why employees find it difficult to speak up.
Okay, well, you know what, that if you provide that, we can actually add it to the show notes. Avinder, this has been amazing. As usual, after sitting through a workshop, I had such a good time, and we were able to spend some time and get to know each other in person. So where is it that you would like people to get a hold of you if they wanted to find out further about some of the things that you're offering? So just let us know where you'd like them
Yeah,
to.
we can go to www.minutemediation.com, and I will also send some information to you where your listeners can find me.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. So what am I'm walking away with? Most of us are technical, and we have been promoted because of technical skills. But actively listening to not give solutions is something that I think most human beings need to continue to work on. I know it's something that I continue to work on in my daily life, not just at work, but also at home. So to think about that is like, how is it that I give myself the time to try to really listen? And if you're not so good at it, try to take some time and practice it. Maybe don't practice it with your most important client, but maybe practice it with somebody that is a trusted person that could give you some feedback. So again, thanks for tuning in. If you're wanting to find out more about your relationships, you can go to roxannedurhodge.com /quiz. There's a quick quiz that you can do to kind of see your level of connectedness or authenticity in your relationships, either at work or at home. And we'll send you a little mini report so you kind of know where you stand with maybe some next steps. So again, Avinder, thanks so much. And for everyone, we'll chat with you next week. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannedurhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.